Imagine a future where your gadgets never run out of power. Well, that can be made real by tiny nuclear battery that defies the need for charging.
A battery that never needs charging for 100 years sounds like fiction. Yet Chinese researchers have built one, and it is life-changing. It does not run on chemicals like every other battery. It runs on something far more powerful. But the world is not ready for such risk. So what is it about this battery that is raising so much concern? Let's find out. The breakthrough. For most of human history, the search for lasting energy has driven some of the greatest discoveries the world has ever seen. From the first crude oil lamp to the lithium battery powering modern smartphones, each step forward promised more power, more efficiency, and more time before the next recharge. But none of those breakthroughs came close to what a group of Chinese researchers unveiled to the world not long ago. They had developed a battery that did not need to be recharged for 100 years. Not a prototype built in theory, not a concept drawn on paper, but a real functioning battery capable. Researchers had been working toward this milestone for years, testing materials, refining designs, and measuring outputs with painstaking precision. What they eventually produced was a battery that drew its energy not from chemical reactions the way conventional batteries do, but from something far older and far more powerful: radioactive decay. The same slow, steady process that has been happening inside certain elements since before the Earth formed was now being put to work inside a device small enough to hold in one hand. The specific material at the heart of this breakthrough was carbon-14, a radioactive isotope that most people associate with archaeological dating rather than power generation. Carbon-14 decays slowly, releasing particles at a rate that scientists can measure and plan around with accuracy. By capturing those particles and converting them into electrical current through a specially designed semiconductor layer, the researchers were able to produce a continuous, stable flow of electricity. The battery did not spike, neither did it drain. It simply kept producing power, day after day, year after year. What made the announcement even more striking was the context in which it arrived. This was not the first time nuclear battery technology had shown signs of life. Earlier devices had already demonstrated that the concept was viable. One notable design had already proven a lifespan approaching 50 years, which at the time seemed extraordinary. The new research pushed that figure to 100 years and beyond. Not by introducing an entirely different approach, but by refining what already worked. The improvements were methodical and incremental, which suggested a technology on a genuine upward trajectory. The researchers involved came from institutions with long records of investment in advanced energy research. Their work had received significant funding and had passed through multiple rounds of peer evaluation before reaching this stage. That institutional backing mattered because it placed the discovery within a larger national effort to lead the world in next-generation energy technology. The battery was not simply a scientific innovation. It was a signal of where China intended to position itself in the decades ahead, at the frontier of energy innovation that other countries were only beginning to seriously explore. The implications of such a feat extends far beyond any single application. The breakthrough carried a broader significance. It proved that the long-standing boundary between nuclear science and everyday energy technology was beginning to dissolve. What had existed only in research papers and theoretical discussions was now moving into the real world. The new battery was a demonstration that the energy assumptions built into modern life, the frequent recharging, constant replacement, and inevitable failure, were not permanent features of the world. They were temporary limitations, and that limitation had just been broken. How the technology works. To understand why a battery lasting 100 years is possible, it helps to first set aside everything familiar about how conventional batteries function. The batteries used in phones, cars, and household devices all operate through chemical reactions. Two materials interact inside a sealed chamber, electrons flow between them, and that movement of electrons becomes electrical current. It works efficiently, but it has a fundamental weakness. The chemicals involved change as they react. Over time, the materials degrade, the reactions slow, and the battery loses its ability to hold or deliver a charge. Nuclear batteries operate on an entirely different principle. They do not rely on chemical reactions at all. Instead, they draw energy from a process that has nothing to do with the movement of molecules or the bonding of atoms in the traditional sense. Certain elements are naturally unstable. Their atomic nuclei contain more energy than the structure can hold indefinitely. And over time, they release that excess energy in the form of particles or radiation. This release happens continuously, at a rate that is entirely predictable based on the element involved. It cannot be sped up or slowed down by pressure, temperature, or any external factor. The specific type of nuclear battery at the center of the Chinese research breakthrough belongs to a category called betavoltaic devices. The name comes from the type of particle involved in the energy conversion process. When certain radioactive materials decay, they emit beta particles, which are high-energy electrons ejected from the nucleus as it reorganizes itself into a more stable configuration. These particles carry kinetic energy, and that energy can be captured and converted into electrical current if the right material is placed in their path. That material is a semiconductor, chosen specifically because of how it responds when struck by incoming particles. The semiconductor layer in a betavoltaic battery works through a mechanism closely related to how solar panels generate electricity. In a solar panel, photons of light strike the semiconductor and knock electrons loose, creating a current. In a betavoltaic battery, beta particles do the same job. They strike the semiconductor with enough energy to displace electrons from their resting positions, and those displaced electrons flow in a consistent direction, producing a steady electrical output. The design is elegant in its simplicity. The choice of radioactive material matters enormously in determining how long the battery lasts and how safe it is to use. Two materials have received the most attention in recent research. Nickel-63 is one of them, a metallic isotope with a half-life of roughly 100 years, meaning it loses half its radioactivity over that period. Carbon-14 is the other, the same isotope used in dating ancient organic material, with a half-life of approximately 5,700 years. Both materials emit low-energy beta particles that do not penetrate deeply into surrounding materials. While earlier betavoltaic designs often relied on nickel-63, which had a relatively straightforward supply chain and a well-understood decay profile. Carbon-14 presented different engineering challenges, particularly around the way the material needed to be shaped and positioned within the semiconductor structure to maximize energy capture. Scientists found that by creating extremely thin layers of the isotope and sandwiching them within precisely manufactured semiconductor sheets, they could dramatically improve the efficiency of the conversion process. The battery produced by this refined process generates power continuously from the moment it is assembled. There is no initial charging cycle, no warm-up period, and no state of rest. The radioactive material begins decaying as soon as it is formed, and the semiconductor begins converting that decay into electricity. The output is low compared to the kind of power drawn from a wall socket or a large lithium battery, but it is uninterrupted. Over the span of decades, the total energy delivered by such a battery adds up to something far beyond what any conventional design could match. The manufacturing process for these batteries remains more complex and costly than producing regular cells, but researchers have demonstrated that the fundamental obstacles are engineering problems rather than theoretical ones. What remains is the work of scaling production, reducing cost, and expanding the range of semiconductor materials that can be paired with different radioactive isotopes. That work is already underway in multiple research programs, and each iteration brings the technology closer to the point where it can move from the laboratory into practical use at scale. Potential game-changing applications. When researchers and engineers consider what a battery lasting 100 years might change, the conversation does not stay in one place for long. The possibilities spread outward quickly, touching fields that seem unrelated at first, but share a common thread. Every one of them has been shaped, limited, or held back by the same fundamental constraint: the need to replace or recharge the power source keeping a device alive. Remove that constraint, and the landscape of what becomes possible shifts in ways that are both practical and profound. Medical technology is often the first domain that comes to mind, and for good reason. Implanted medical devices have transformed the treatment of serious conditions over the past several decades. Small machines placed inside the body help to manage and improve health issues, thereby extending the lives of millions of people across the world. But every one of them runs on a battery, and every battery eventually runs out. When that happens, the patient must undergo a procedure to have the old device removed and a new one implanted. That procedure carries risk, requires recovery time, and adds financial burden to an already difficult situation. A nuclear battery lasting a century would remove that cycle entirely for most patients. A device implanted in a person at the age of 50 could remain functional and active for the rest of their natural life without requiring a single additional surgery related to power. The implications for patient outcomes are incredible, but so are the implications for healthcare systems managing aging populations and rising procedural costs. Fewer follow-up surgeries mean fewer opportunities for complications, fewer hospital stays, and fewer demands on medical staff. The battery's value in this context is not just technical, it is humanitarian in the most direct sense. Remote monitoring presents another category of applications where the technology would represent a substantial improvement. The world is covered in sensors. They track seismic activity along fault lines, measure water pressure in underground reservoirs, monitor the structural integrity of bridges and dams, and collect atmospheric data from mountain ranges and ocean surfaces. Many of these sensors are placed in locations that are difficult or dangerous to access regularly. Because of this problem, some sensors are simply left to fail once their batteries die, leaving gaps in the data they were meant to collect. Replacing their batteries requires sending technicians into remote terrain, underwater environments, or high-altitude installations at significant cost and with real safety risk. However, nuclear batteries would allow those sensors to operate continuously for decades without any maintenance. A network of seismic monitors placed along an active fault zone could transmit data for a century, building a record of geological activity far richer than anything currently possible. Ocean floor sensors tracking temperature and salinity changes related to climate patterns could stay active long enough to capture meaningful trends across multiple human generations. The scientific value of uninterrupted long-term data collection at this scale is difficult to overstate. Many of the most important questions about how the planet is changing can only be answered with data gathered over extended periods, and the data has too often been cut short by a dead battery. Space exploration stands as perhaps the most technically demanding context in which nuclear battery technology could prove decisive. Missions sent beyond the inner solar system face a fundamental energy problem. Solar panels, which power most spacecraft operating near Earth or Mars, become nearly useless in the deep outer solar system, where sunlight is too faint to generate useful electricity. The missions that have traveled farthest have depended on nuclear power systems called radioisotope thermoelectric generators. These systems worked, but they are large, expensive, and produce heat that must be carefully managed. Betavoltaic nuclear batteries offer a different approach. They generate electricity directly from particle emission without the heat byproduct, and they can be made far more compact than thermoelectric generators. For small probes or scientific instruments attached to larger spacecraft, they could provide reliable, long-duration power without the engineering complexity that heat-based systems require. A probe designed to drift through the outer solar system for 50 or 70 years, collecting data and transmitting it back, could carry its own power source without depending on proximity to the sun. Autonomous systems on Earth also stand to benefit enormously. Remote weather stations in polar regions currently require expensive resupply expeditions just to keep their batteries functional. Agricultural sensors buried in fields to monitor soil moisture and temperature go dark when their power runs out, disrupting the data farmers rely on to make irrigation and planting decisions. Underwater drones designed to survey coral reefs, map ocean floors, or track the movement of deep-sea currents are limited in range and endurance by the batteries they carry. In every one of these cases, the introduction of a century-lasting power source does not merely improve performance. It removes a constraint that has defined the boundaries of what the technology can do. The common thread running through all of these applications is not just convenience or cost savings. It is continuity. A battery that lasts a century allows systems to operate, collect, and respond without interruption across timeframes that no previous power source could support. That continuity is a change in the relationship between technology and time, challenges and concerns. When a technology arrives with the kind of promise attached to nuclear batteries, the scientific community begins asking harder questions. Those questions are not expressions of pessimism or resistance to progress. They are the essential work of understanding what a technology actually is, what it requires, and what it might cost before it can deliver what its creators claim. In the case of nuclear batteries, those questions have produced a set of concerns serious enough to shape the entire trajectory of how this technology develops and whether it can cross the distance between laboratory achievement and real-world adoption. The most immediate limitation is one that the researchers themselves acknowledge openly. The batteries currently produce very small amounts of electricity. Yeah, they output from a betavoltaic cell using carbon-14 or nickel-63 is measured in microwatts, which is a unit so small that it sits far below what most people would recognize as useful power. A smartphone requires thousands of times more energy than these batteries currently deliver. A laptop requires tens of thousands of times more. Even many of the low-power sensors and medical devices that seem like natural matches for the technology require more output than current designs consistently provide. The gap between the battery's demonstrated capability and the power demands of most practical applications is not a minor engineering challenge. It is a substantial obstacle that will require significant advances in semiconductor efficiency and material performance to overcome. The source of that power limitation lies in the nature of radioactive decay itself, the property that makes nuclear batteries last so long. The slow, measured release of particles over decades or centuries is also what keeps their output low. Decay happens at a fixed rate determined by the isotope's half-life. There is no way to accelerate it to meet higher demand, no way to draw more current when a device needs a burst of power, and no way to store excess energy for later use the way a rechargeable battery can. Furthermore, the physics that creates the longevity also creates the ceiling. Researchers working to close that gap are exploring thinner semiconductor layers, more efficient conversion geometries, and combinations of multiple isotopes, but none of those approaches have yet produced output levels that would satisfy the requirements of most consumer or industrial applications. Safety concerns represent a separate and more emotionally charged category of expert worry. The materials used in betavoltaic batteries are radioactive, and that fact carries weight regardless of the specific type of radiation involved. Carbon-14 and nickel-63 emit low-energy beta particles that cannot penetrate skin or thin metal casing, and under normal operating conditions, a properly manufactured nuclear battery poses no measurable radiation risk to the person using it. But the conditions that engineers describe in controlled lab settings do not always reflect what happens in the real world. Batteries get damaged, devices get dropped, crushed, or submerged. Manufacturing defects occur. In those cases, the containment assumptions that make the technology appear safe begin to look more fragile. The question of what happens to a nuclear battery at the end of its useful life also has no simple answer. Radioactive materials do not stop being radioactive simply because a device has stopped functioning. Carbon-14 will continue decaying for thousands of years after the battery it powered has been discarded. Nickel-63 will remain active for centuries. If nuclear batteries were to achieve mass adoption and eventually reach the same volume of production and disposal as conventional batteries, the accumulated radioactive waste created by discarded devices would require permanent, carefully managed storage solutions that current infrastructure is not equipped to handle. The disposal challenge is not impossible to address, but it is not trivial either, and experts who work in nuclear waste management have been consistent in raising it as a concern that must be addressed before the technology scales. Security concerns form another layer of expert unease. The radioactive materials used in nuclear batteries are not weapons grade and cannot be directly used to build nuclear warheads. But they are radioactive, and even low-level radioactive materials can be misused by actors seeking to create dirty bombs. Devices designed not to produce a nuclear explosion, but to spread radioactive contamination across a populated area. The concern is not that nuclear batteries themselves are weapons. It is that a large global supply chain for radioactive isotopes, if not tightly regulated and monitored, creates more opportunities for diversion, theft, or misuse than currently exist. The infrastructure required to manufacture, distribute, and eventually dispose of nuclear batteries would need to be secured at a level that standard consumer electronics supply chains are not designed to maintain. Public trust may ultimately prove to be the most difficult of all. Decades of association between the word nuclear and the imagery of bombs, meltdowns, and invisible contamination have left a lasting imprint on how large portions of the population understand and respond to anything connected to radioactivity. Even when the science clearly shows that a particular application is safe, the word itself triggers apprehension that evidence alone does not easily dissolve. The institutions promoting them will need to engage seriously with public understanding, not dismiss concern as irrational, but address it with transparency. The bigger picture, promise versus uncertainty. Technologies that carry the potential to reshape entire industries rarely arrive with straightforward adoption paths, clear regulatory frameworks, or universal agreement about whether their benefits outweigh their costs. They arrive in the middle of ongoing debates, surrounded by competing interests, unresolved technical questions, and the weight of whatever came before them that used similar materials or carried similar names. Nuclear batteries are no exception. They sit at an intersection of genuine scientific achievement and legitimate global uncertainty, and understanding what they mean for the future requires holding both of those things in mind at the same time. The promise is real and it is substantial. A power source that generates electricity continuously for a century, without recharging, without chemical degradation, and without dependence on sunlight or external fuel, represents a qualitative departure from every energy storage technology that preceded it. The applications that become possible when power supply is effectively removed as a limiting factor span medicine, environmental science, space exploration, infrastructure, and autonomous systems. Each of those domains has been shaped for decades by the practical constraints of battery life, and in each of them, the removal of that constraint opens possibilities that researchers and engineers are only beginning to fully map. The uncertainty is equally real, and closing that gap will require sustained research investment, manufacturing innovation, and advances in semiconductor science that may take years or decades to fully materialize. There is no guarantee that the efficiency improvements needed will arrive on a schedule that keeps pace with the expectations now being attached to the technology. Regulatory environments around the world are not currently configured to manage the kind of supply chains that widespread nuclear battery adoption would require. The frameworks governing radioactive materials were built around nuclear power plants, medical isotope production, and weapons programs. They were not designed with consumer electronics or mass-market medical devices in mind. Adapting those frameworks to accommodate a new category of radioactive product used at a scale potentially reaching hundreds of millions of units annually would require a whole lot. The cost of manufacturing nuclear batteries at scale remains poorly understood, in part because production has not yet reached a volume that would allow accurate cost modeling. The isotopes involved, particularly carbon-14 in the refined forms needed for battery production, are not currently available in quantities that would support mass manufacturing. Producing them in those quantities would require expansion of existing isotope production facilities or construction of new ones, both of which involve significant capital investment and long development timelines. Meanwhile, China's position at the forefront of nuclear battery development is not simply a matter of scientific priority. It reflects a national strategy to lead in technologies that could define energy infrastructure for the next century. Other nations with significant research and production capacity are watching closely and weighing their own investment strategies in response. Competitive pressure tends to accelerate research timelines, which can be beneficial for the technology's overall advancement, but it can also create pressure to move faster than safety evaluation and regulatory development can responsibly follow. What this technology ultimately becomes will depend on how those competing forces resolve. If the challenges are met, the outcome could be genuinely transformative. The 100-year battery would move from a laboratory achievement to a feature of the world, embedded in the devices that monitor health, the systems that watch the planet, and the machines sent to explore beyond it. If those conditions are not met, the technology may remain extraordinary in principle, but limited in practice, a proof of concept that pointed toward a future it never quite reached. The difference between those two outcomes is not yet established,